Well, good morning. I always have the unenviable task of following Nolan at all of these conferences. I think Doug's got something out against me, but we'll see what we can do. I also am not a climate scientist or a forecaster, so I'm really just regurgitating other people's information. So if it's completely wrong, I have no risk in telling you. And as Nolan has already shown, we at best do a mediocre job of predicting long-range forecasts. So I'll give you the information and you can do with it what you can. So picking up where Nolan left off, and I don't have much of the retrospective, but July was a really dry month statewide in Colorado. August, we're doing a little bit better. What does this mean for drought in Colorado? And this is last week. So it was updated yesterday, and there was a little bit, I don't have a pointer, but there was a little bit more of an introduction of D0 throughout, kind of connecting those two sections of yellow from the southwest up to the north. So we are seeing a little bit of dry conditions throughout the state, a little bit of D1 creeping in across the northern Front Range, but compared to where we've been the last couple of years, we're doing pretty well. Statewide, as far as reservoir storage, these are the slides that Nolan breezed through right at the end. We're doing great. The upper Rio Grande is the lowest in the state, but they're actually a whole lot better than they were in years past. They've kind of been consistently climbing in their reservoir storage over the last couple of years. So even though they're the lowest in the state, they're in a much better position than they have been. So what does that mean for the future? Well, as Nolan talked about, we had an El Nino year last year. We had a really strong El Nino. And, in the climate world, we talk about El Nino, we talk about ENSO, and people nod and they shake their head and they say, yeah, El Nino wet, La Nina dry. They have no clue what El Nino or ENSO is. So I decided I'd take this opportunity to give you guys a little tutorial. So bear with me. What is ENSO and why is it so important? So ENSO is El Nino Southern Oscillation. Yes, it does not include, it does not in its title include La Nina, but that's because they didn't discover La Nina until after they had already named it. But it's really one of the most important atmospheric circulation phenomenon in that it can really impact both temperature and precipitation on a global scale. And it's a single climate phenomenon, but it has three different states: El Nino, La Nina, and then neutral conditions. And we'll get to neutral conditions in just a few minutes. Generally, El Nino means a warming. So the top one here is La Nina, the bottom one is El Nino. So two things have to happen to have El Nino or La Nina conditions. You have to have the surface temperatures of the ocean and the atmospheric circulation, the trade winds kind of working together to create the kind of perfect storm. So a La Nina generally is a cooling of the surface and a strengthening of those winds, whereas El Nino is the opposite. It's a warming of the surface and then a weakening or a reversing of the winds. So now when anyone asks you what ENSO is, you can tell them. So what does that mean, and why does it matter for Colorado? Well, at the top, sorry, I switched these on you. The last one, La Nina was on top. So the top is El Nino, the bottom is La Nina, and you can see that what it's doing is there's a really big difference in the jet stream and the storm tracks. So with El Nino, you get kind of wetter, stormier conditions in the south, and less stormy, drier conditions in the north. With La Nina, again, it's reverse. So your northern jet stream, you get a much more wave-like jet stream. It's bringing in cooler or wetter conditions to the north, and then drier, less stormy conditions to the south. Because we fall in that southern portion, La Nina tends to be drier in Colorado. El Nino tends to be wetter in Colorado, but it's not necessarily a done deal. So this is what it looks like as far as the risk of extreme wetness or dryness, the top being La Nina, the bottom being El Nino. So this is the first map is for December, January, February. The second is for January, February, March. So you can get a sense of kind of what the tendency tends to be. in wetness versus dryness in Colorado. And Colorado's in this unique spot where we're kind of right on the cusp, right? We don't necessarily directly follow what's happening to the south or to the north of us, and we can kind of swing one way or the other depending on where those storm tracks fall. And like Nolan said, one or two storm tracks can really make the difference for our overall precipitation. So again, it's hard to say in Colorado sometimes because we do kind of fall right on that threshold. All right, so this is where we've been for El Nino and La Nina. El Nino is red, La Nina is blue, and everything in between is neutral conditions. In order for NOAA to consider something an El Nino or a La Nina, it needs to hit the critical thresholds of half a degree for above or below for 3 consistent months. It's like a running average. And so this is where we are right now. We are currently in neutral conditions. And this is what the predictions say going forward. So really what this tells us is that most of the forecasts are predicting a borderline or weak La Nina starting in the northern hemisphere fall and persisting through the winter of 2016-2017. But because we are in neutral conditions, forecasters feel less confident about what that tells us and where we could go. And so there's less confidence and less guidance in those forecasts. Another way of looking at it as far as where we are and where we might be going up through March, April, May of next year, you can see that most of the forecasters are again predicting that we're going to be in a moderate La Nina into the winter. After that, it's kind of up in the air as far as what may happen. Most are favoring neutral conditions, less favoring El Nino or La Nina conditions. So, back to these maps that Nolan completely just discredited. What does this all mean? Perhaps it means nothing. These are the 3-month probability forecasts from the Climate Prediction Center at NOAA. And so these were just released last week. So we're looking at September, October, November going forward. Temperature probability is warm for the vast majority of the state, particularly the southwestern portion of Colorado, but all of Colorado is warmer. This is, in the day and age of climate change, this is kind of what we've been seeing with temperatures. We've been warmer. And projections are that we will continue to be so. Oops, wrong button, sorry. Precipitation, which is what all of you guys care about as water providers, as folks in the water world, I got nothing. Equal chance means NOAA's got nothing. And Nolan already proved that none of these slides really verify very well anyway, so I guess that's the trifecta of nothing. But they're not really sure. And a big part of that is because we're not really sure how the La Nina is going to play out, or if it is even going to be a La Nina. And one of the things that we know is that La Nina doesn't necessarily mean drought. It doesn't necessarily mean we're going to see below average conditions for precipitation, especially because we have had a record high PDO, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, this spring, and La Nina would have to overcome that. That can be very challenging. There's actually a tutorial on NOAA's Twitter feed today about what is PDO, what does it mean, and is it important? So I won't give you a tutorial on that this morning, but you guys can go ahead to Twitter after this and look that up and how ENSO and the Pacific Decadal Oscillation interact with each other and what it means. But it doesn't necessarily mean dry conditions in Colorado. And if you look at past examples of when we had a really high PDO and a moderate La Nina in the winter months, we come up with winters like 1983 and 1984 or 1995 and 1996, both of which were decent snow years within Colorado. And so La Nina does not necessarily mean drought. Yes, we do tend to be drier in La Nina years than El Nino, but going into a La Nina does not mean doom for all. How's that for optimistic? But Just because we are not necessarily in doomed conditions does not mean you shouldn't be planning, does not mean you should not be thinking ahead. We all know that planning for a crisis in the midst of a crisis is a very bad idea, and that you should be thinking ahead. So if your communities have not yet adopted drought planning efforts and do not have drought plans in progress, you should reach out to CWCB. We have money and funds to help you through this process. We have tools and resources, and you get to work with me, so I'm sure it would be a ball and super fun. So reach out to us so that when we do start to see these dry conditions, when we do start to see drought become more prolific in the state, which I'm sure we will, again, as we do 9 out of every 10 years, see some portion of drought in some portion of the state, you and your community will be ready. I think that's all I have.
We've got time for maybe 1 or 2 questions if they're quick. Yes, over here. Hang on, Brett.
So this could be for Nolan or for Taryn, but from a planning perspective, if I have heard the two of you correctly, we seem to see a trend in warming, but we can be, dogmatically schizophrenic about precipitation?
Nolan, I'll start and then you can jump in. We haven't seen any long-term trends in precipitation in the state of Colorado. We have seen long-term trends in temperature. So we've warmed 2 degrees in the last 30 years, 2.5 in the last 50 years, and the projections are that we will warm another 2 to 5 degrees in the next, by mid-century. As far as precipitation, again, because of where Colorado is located, we're right kind of at this mid-latitude region. And when you look at climate projections, they say, the hardest areas to predict are these mid-latitude, landlocked, areas with highly diverse terrain. Well, that's Colorado. And so we haven't seen any trends over the last 30 or 50 years with respect to precipitation, and we're not entirely sure what we're going to see going forward.
Taryn? Over here.
Okay.
It seems like our last El Nino, or super warm El Nino, didn't behave like most El Ninos. I wonder if you'd comment on that. And then related to that, what's happened to the blob that seemed to be related to that particularly warm El Nino, that big warm block that was off the Oregon, Washington, Northern California, and on up to Alaska coasts?
So I'm going to do I'm going to try to answer your question, but again, refer back to earlier statements. I am not a climate forecaster. It didn't respond the way we expected it to, and part of that is because of the other things that were going on. The record high Pacific Decadal Oscillation really impacted how the ENSO performed, and so it didn't perform the way we expected. That blob off the Pacific coast that they thought was going to really materialize kind of just dissipated, and so forecasters have had a really hard time in the last couple of years because ENSO has been historically seen as one of the most predictable phenomenon, and so they've put a lot of energy and effort because it does have an impact, and so they've really tried to put a lot of research and funds towards improving long-term seasonal predictability. But then you've got all these other factors that are coming in ways that they haven't traditionally come in the past, and it changes how they interact and how they materialize. And so we're learning a lot as we see these new conditions arise, but it's not necessarily helping us verify those forecasts. Nolan, would you add anything to that? Nothing? Wow.